Hello, welcome to this game review. We'll have a look at a quite high-level game by two players in which Black had the upper hand for most of the game, but then he was a bit hesitant to take up space and did what happens so often. He just exchanged everything off the board, did every capture that was available, and lost his advantage this way. And this is quite a common problem. When there is a lot of tension in the position, we sense the tension ourselves and we try to relieve it at the cost of ruining our position. So let's take a look. So I started d4, g6, already kind of dubious. Black shouldn't really give up the center like this. Of course, it's possible to play like this. This is quite hyper-modern, so to say. But in general, if we want to improve, we should kind of try to play more correct chess. And then when we're too good, so to say, at taking the center, then we can look at stuff like g6. But okay, we have the kind of a Benoni type of thing. After d5, white is a bit better. Black can sacrifice a pawn like this if he wants, or just play the normal Benoni. But either way, white is a bit better. White was hesitant to take up space. Again, if white is at 2300 on chess.com, I assume he knew that d5 was the best move here, but perhaps he was scared of going into sharp Benoni positions. Knight c3, and now black is doing very well, because in this move order, white did not have time to play e4 and bishop e3 to set up the Marozzi bind. So for example, if e4 had happened, this would be good for white, because he is in time to defend the d4 knight. But these are opening stuff. Okay, and knight takes on c6, which isn't ideal most of the time, but there wasn't much else white could do here. He could play e3, but black is doing quite fine here. Okay, now we get this structure. In general, black's plan is usually to play knight f6 castles, d6, c5, and bishop b7. This is usually how they play here. But okay, bishop d2 is a bit strange. Knight f6, g3, and black plays d5, which is also sensible enough, as black has the pawn on c6. He can take up the center. Bishop g2 castles, and here black plays bishop b7, which is a strange move, because the bishop is now looking at two of his own pawns, and unless we're sure that we can somehow open it up with d4, c5, the bishop is simply badly placed here. Here black could consider some dynamics by taking here, for example, if here then here, and the material is equal, but black is a bit better developed. b2 is a bit of a weakness, but it's not necessary. Also, black could at any point take up space like this, and perhaps took up more space a bit later. Okay, bishop b7. Now white identifies the weak square on c5, which is why I would usually suggest playing like this in this structure. Okay, e5, and the bishop has to go back to c8, not a good sign. Bishop c3, the bishop is kind of just provoking d4, which is in general a decent space gaining move for black. And rook e8, defending the pawn, and f4, which is kind of very risky positionally, as it weakens the e pawn, it weakens the e3 square, also weakens the king long term. Basically weakens everything that white could have weakened, and white isn't really creating many too serious threats here. So black answered with knight g4, so he is eyeing up the square on e3, which is sensible enough. Black could also again take up the space with d4, which is interesting. Also taking here is probably the most accurate. For white was probably going to take like this, and from here black can just develop, and his rook has now been activated. He doesn't really have to prove anything, and white's play on the f-file is not very much. At knight g4, queen d2, and this is a bit too much by white. Now queen b6, black is already aiming to win some material. b4, as the knight was pinned. a5 is possible. Again, black could take up space with d4, and for example, after bishop b2, now even knight e3 is possible, forking some stuff. And black is dominating here. He will just have to develop the bishop, and white has a lot of holes in the center which were created by the move f4. Okay, a5 is possible, getting rid of this pawn. a3 was played, and now black for some reason decided on a quick decision on taking on b4, but there was no reason to allow white exchanges. Black could just take the center with d4, bishop b2 has to be played. Now we have the square on e3 again, which we can use instantly, but we can also just develop, threatening e4 in some positions, which would completely freeze white's position. And black is in general just a bit better, quite a bit better. And in general, when we play g6 on move 1, it's unsurprising that later the player with black is hesitant to take up space, as he didn't take up space when he had a chance on move 1. Okay, ab, but this just relieves too much pressure. Now black has to capture the rook, and he does. And white could have captured with the bishop, firstly to not allow d4 with tempo, and also to keep the rook on the f file, which is perhaps more useful than on the a file. Okay, rook a1, ef. Again, black is just exchanging everything for some reason. Again, he had the chance to take space with d4, bishop b2, and he can take here, but he can even take here. Now that there is no rook on the f file, this is quite horrible for white. The queen can't take because the rook goes there, but either way, positionally, white is basically busted here. Okay, ef. Now white gets to exchange this bishop, and black has lost all of his space by taking here. Queen d4 and cd, and now a lot of exchanges happen. Bishop d5, and black plays fg. It's unclear why not bishop e3 to get rid of this bishop. But okay, fg, hg, rook e2, rook a8, and now black has to go back, and white found this tactic, rook c8, after which everything is cleaned off the board. White takes here, black takes here, which is a nice move to find, and here bishop f7 is the only move, as otherwise black will be left with a 3-on-1 majority here. And at the end of all these tactics, black is left with a pawn advantage. Here, by the way, white could have played this check, which is a lot better because now he will get a pawn of his own, and here matters would be quite drawn. But after this, clearly black is better, but he can't really win this position as the pawns are all on one side. Black could create a passed pawn, but a passed pawn will be an h-pawn, which means pawn endgames are also drawn, and black's only real chance to win would be to somehow bring his king to g4 and take this pawn, or exchange queens without changing the pawn structure, which would, or at least changing it like this. But it's unlikely that white would allow this, so this game ended in a draw. Quite soon, black tried something, but there wasn't too much to try, just that in this position black had a pretty decent move, queen h1, checkmate, but after this was missed for somehow, queen g4, and the rest of the game was a draw, and after a million checks the players agreed. But at this point it's hard to explain how black should try to win. In general, it's probably not really possible against decent defense.